My name is Julius Malema. There is a story I have never fully shared before. It is not a story about politics. It is not a story about elections, speeches, or power. It is a story about exhaustion. It is a story about reaching the point where I could no longer carry the weight that I believed was mine to carry. For many years, I convinced myself that if I worked harder, thought faster, and pushed myself further, I could help solve the problems facing South Africa. Every day, I heard the cries of people struggling to survive. I heard the frustration of fathers who could not find work. I listened to mothers trying to feed their families with almost nothing. I saw communities living with poverty, crime, inequality, and hopelessness. At the same time, I faced constant criticism, endless expectations, and pressure from every direction. Everyone seemed to want answers. Everyone seemed to demand solutions, and I believed I had to provide them. I attended meeting after meeting. I listened to economists, policy experts, activists, business leaders, and ordinary citizens. I studied problems from every angle. Yet the harder I worked, the more I discovered a painful truth. Human beings have limits. Political power has limits. Governments have limits. Even the strongest leaders eventually reach a point where they realize they cannot control everything. I did not want to admit that reality. I kept pushing forward. I kept carrying burdens that were becoming heavier with each passing day. Then one night, after a season of deep physical and emotional exhaustion, something happened that changed the course of my life. I went to sleep carrying the concerns of an entire nation in my heart. But before morning came, I experienced something I could never forget. A dream that forced me to confront not only my responsibilities as a leader, but also my relationship with faith, rest, and God Himself. What happened in that dream would eventually lead me to observe the Sabbath for the first time in many years. And what I learned from that experience transformed the way I see leadership, responsibility, and the purpose of my life. This is that story. There was a period in my life when I felt as though the entire weight of South Africa was resting on my shoulders. Every morning began with another report of hardship. Another family struggling to put food on the table. Another young person unable to find work. Another community battling crime, poverty, and hopelessness. As a leader, I believed it was my duty to pay attention to these realities. I believed it was my responsibility to search for solutions. The people deserved that much. So I threw myself into the work. I attended meetings from early morning until late at night. I listened to experts present economic forecasts. I studied policies designed to create jobs and improve living conditions. I spoke with workers, business owners, students, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens. Everyone had concerns. Everyone had expectations. Everyone wanted change. And many believed leaders should have all the answers. The truth is that leadership can sometimes become a lonely place. People see speeches. They see public appearances. They see confidence. What they often do not see are the sleepless nights. They do not see the moments when a leader sits alone wondering whether the decisions being made are enough. They do not see the burden of knowing that millions of lives can be affected by choices made in government offices and meeting rooms. During that season, I became consumed by responsibility. I constantly asked myself what more could be done, what policy had been overlooked, what solution had not yet been discovered, what action might finally bring relief to people who had suffered for so long. The more I searched, the more I realized how complex the problems were. Some issues had existed for generations. Some wounds were deeply rooted in history. Some challenges could not be solved quickly, regardless of how determined a leader might be. Yet I continued carrying them as though everything depended on me. I convinced myself that stopping was not an option. Rest felt like weakness. Slowing down felt irresponsible. Taking time away felt selfish. While others slept, I kept thinking. While others rested, I kept planning. While others stepped back, I kept pushing forward. At first, I thought this dedication was a strength. Later, I realized it was becoming a burden. The pressure slowly affected every part of my life. My mind rarely became quiet. Even during moments that should have brought peace, my thoughts returned to the problems facing the nation. I would think about unemployment. I would think about inequality. I would think about the frustrations of ordinary people who felt forgotten. The burden followed me everywhere. What made it even heavier was the realization that no matter how much effort I invested, new problems continued to appear. Every solution seemed to reveal another challenge. Every victory seemed temporary. Every step forward was followed by another obstacle. It felt like carrying water in my hands. No matter how tightly I held it, some always slipped away. One day, while reflecting on everything happening around me, a difficult truth began to emerge. I was trying to carry responsibilities that no human being was designed to carry alone. I had slowly started believing that everything depended on my strength. Everything depended on my wisdom. Everything depended on my ability to find answers. The more I believed that, the heavier the burden became. Many people think power removes pressure. In reality, power often multiplies it. The greater that gets that responsibility, the greater the temptation to believe that you must solve everything yourself. That was exactly the trap I had fallen into. I was carrying problems that belonged to an entire nation as though they belonged to me alone. I was carrying fears that were beyond my control. I was carrying expectations that no human being could fully satisfy. And eventually, I reached my limit. Not because I stopped caring, not because I lost hope, but because I finally encountered the reality of my own humanity. I was not all-powerful. I was not all-knowing. I was not capable of fixing every broken thing in the world. That realization was painful. Leaders do not like admitting weakness. We prefer to project confidence. We prefer to appear strong. We prefer to believe we can overcome any challenge through determination and hard work. But there comes a moment when reality forces honesty upon us. For me, that moment arrived during one of the most exhausting seasons of my life. I remember lying down one evening feeling completely drained, physically tired, mentally exhausted, emotionally overwhelmed. The concerns of the nation were still running through my mind. The faces of struggling families were still before me. The questions I could not answer were still weighing heavily on my heart. I closed my eyes, believing the next day would simply bring more pressure, more responsibility, and more burdens to carry. I had no idea that before morning arrived, something extraordinary was about to happen. I had no idea that a dream would challenge everything I believed about leadership, responsibility, and faith. And I certainly had no idea that the lesson waiting for me would begin with something as simple and as difficult as learning how to stop. The burden had brought me to my limit, but perhaps reaching that limit was exactly where God intended a deeper lesson to begin. That night, as sleep finally overtook me, I entered a dream unlike any I had ever experienced before. And what I saw there would stay with me forever. That night, after weeks of carrying burdens that felt heavier than ever before, I finally fell asleep. I expected nothing unusual. I thought the night would pass like any other, but what I experienced felt different from an ordinary dream. It felt vivid. It felt real. It felt as though I had stepped into a place where every distraction had been removed. In the dream, I found myself standing in a part of South Africa that looked familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. I saw roads filled with ordinary people. I saw workers returning home after long days. I saw young people searching for opportunities. I saw mothers caring for children. I saw elderly men and women carrying the marks of difficult lives. There were no government buildings. There were no conference halls. There were no political rallies. There were no cameras. There were only people. The very people whose struggles had been occupying my thoughts for so long. As I watched them, I noticed someone walking among them. At first, I could not fully understand who it was. There was nothing that suggested wealth, nothing that suggested political authority, nothing that suggested earthly power. Yet everyone around him seemed touched by his presence. People who appeared burdened became calmer. People who looked afraid seemed comforted. People who appeared forgotten seemed seen. Then I understood it was Jesus. He was not standing above the people. He was walking among them. He was not surrounded by luxury. He was surrounded by ordinary men and women, the unemployed, the struggling, the overlooked, the weary, the forgotten. As I watched, something inside me began to change. The pressure that had been building within me suddenly became quiet. The constant noise in my mind disappeared. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace. Not because the problems of the nation had vanished, not because every challenge had been solved, but because His presence carried a peace that seemed stronger than every problem around us. I followed Him through the crowd. No one appeared rushed. No one appeared anxious. Everything felt calm. Then Jesus stopped and looked directly at me. I cannot adequately describe that moment. There was no anger in His eyes. There was no condemnation. There was no accusation. There was only truth. A truth that seemed to look through every layer of pride, fear, ambition, responsibility, and exhaustion that I had been carrying. For a moment, I could not speak. I felt exposed, not exposed before a crowd, exposed before God. I felt as though every burden I had been carrying was visible to Him. Every fear, every frustration, every sleepless night, every attempt to control things that were beyond my control. Then He spoke. His words were simple, yet they carried more weight than any speech I had ever heard. He said, "Tomorrow is the Sabbath. Rest. Give these burdens to me." That was all. No long sermon, no complicated explanation, just a simple instruction. Rest. Give these burdens to me. Immediately I felt resistance rising within me. Even in the dream, I argued with the idea. Part of me wanted to obey. Another part of me wanted to reject what I had heard. I remember thinking about the problems facing South Africa. I remember thinking about the expectations placed upon leaders. I remember thinking about everything that still needed to be done. How could I rest? How could I stop? How could I step away when so many people were suffering? The thought seemed impossible. In my heart, I believed the nation needed constant attention. I believed every hour mattered. I believed stopping would mean falling behind. I believed resting would somehow be irresponsible. But as those thoughts raced through my mind, Jesus simply continued looking at me. There was no argument, no debate, no attempt to force me, only calm certainty. And slowly I began to understand something I had never fully considered before. Perhaps my refusal to rest was not strength. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps somewhere along the way I had begun believing that everything depended on me. Perhaps I had forgotten that God had been carrying people long before I arrived. And perhaps He would continue carrying them long after I was gone. That realization struck me deeply. For years, I had spoken about serving people. For years, I had spoken about justice and responsibility. Yet I had quietly developed the belief that my effort alone could hold everything together. The dream exposed that belief. It revealed how much trust I had placed in my own abilities and how little trust I had placed in God's ability to work beyond my limitations. The crowd around us continued moving. Workers continued walking. Families continued talking. Children continued playing. Life continued unfolding, yet Jesus remained completely at peace. Not because he ignored suffering, not because he was unaware of hardship, but because he understood something I had forgotten. God does not ask human beings to carry the weight of the entire world. That responsibility belongs to him. The more I reflected on his words, the more I felt the burden begin to loosen. Not disappear, but loosen. The pressure that had dominated my thinking no longer seemed impossible. For the first time, I considered the possibility that true leadership might require surrender as much as effort. Perhaps faith was not only about working hard, perhaps faith was also about trusting God with what I could not control. Then the dream began to fade. The crowd slowly disappeared. The streets became distant. The scene around me grew quiet. But before everything vanished completely, his words remained clear in my mind. Tomorrow is the Sabbath. Rest, give these burdens to me. I woke up early the next morning. The room was silent. The dream was over. Yet the message remained, stronger than ever. I sat there for a long time thinking about what I had seen. Part of me wanted to dismiss it. Part of me wanted to return immediately to my normal routine. But another part of me knew that something significant had happened. The dream had exposed a struggle that existed deep within me. A struggle between trust and control, between faith and fear, between surrender and self-reliance. And although I did not fully understand it yet, I knew a decision was waiting for me. Would I continue carrying every burden alone? Or would I finally learn the lesson Jesus had placed before me? The answer would begin with 4 truths that I would soon discover, truths that would completely reshape the way I understood leadership, power, responsibility, and faith. When I woke up after that dream, I could not stop thinking about what I had seen. The image of Jesus walking among ordinary people remained in my mind. His words continued echoing in my heart. Tomorrow is the Sabbath. Rest. Give these burdens to me. At first, I thought the lesson was only about rest. But as I reflected more deeply, I began to realize that God was teaching me something much larger. The dream was not simply about taking a day away from work. It was about changing the way I understood leadership itself. Over time, 4 important lessons became clear. Each one challenged assumptions I had carried for years. Each one forced me to examine my own heart. And each one continues to influence how I think about responsibility today. The first lesson was integrity. In public life, people often focus on results. They measure leaders by victories, achievements, popularity, or influence. Those things matter. But Jesus seemed to be showing me that character matters even more. A leader can gain power and still lose integrity. A leader can win elections and still fail morally. A leader can receive applause while quietly compromising the principles that once guided them. The dream forced me to ask difficult questions. Was I remaining true to my convictions? Was I making decisions based on what was right or based on what was politically convenient? Was I protecting my reputation more than I was protecting truth? Those questions were uncomfortable, but growth rarely happens through comfort. I began to understand that leadership without integrity eventually becomes empty. People may follow authority for a time, but lasting trust is built on honesty, consistency, and moral courage. The second lesson was that people must always come before politics. This may sound obvious, yet it is surprisingly easy for leaders to lose sight of it. Political systems can become complicated. Parties become focused on strategy. Governments become focused on procedures. Organizations become focused on maintaining influence. Before long, people can become secondary to the systems that were originally created to serve them. That is not what I saw in the dream. Jesus was not walking among institutions. He was walking among people. He was paying attention to individuals. Their pain mattered. Their struggles mattered. Their dignity mattered. I realized that every policy, every debate, every political decision should ultimately serve real human beings. Not statistics, not headlines, not political ambitions. Human beings. The unemployed father trying to provide for his family. The young graduate searching for opportunity. The grandmother raising grandchildren. The worker struggling to make ends meet. Leadership loses its purpose when it forgets the people it was meant to serve. That lesson struck me deeply. The third lesson was perhaps the most challenging. I learned that silence in the face of injustice is never acceptable. Throughout history, many people have chosen silence because speaking carries consequences. Silence can feel safer. Silence can protect careers. Silence can preserve relationships. Silence can avoid conflict. But silence can also allow suffering to continue. As I reflected on the life of Jesus, I saw someone who consistently spoke for those whose voices were ignored. He challenged hypocrisy. He confronted injustice. He defended the vulnerable. He did not remain silent simply because speaking would create opposition. That realization challenged me personally. Every leader faces moments when remaining silent appears easier than telling the truth. Every leader faces pressure to avoid difficult conversations. Every leader encounters situations where compromise seems attractive. But true leadership requires moral courage, not aggression, not arrogance, courage, the courage to stand for what is right even when doing so is unpopular, the courage to defend human dignity even when powerful interests oppose it, the courage to speak when silence would be more comfortable. The fourth lesson was humility. This lesson may have been the most important of all. Humility is often misunderstood. Some people think humility means weakness. Others think humility means thinking less of yourself. But genuine humility is simply seeing yourself truthfully. It means recognizing both your strengths and your limitations. It means understanding that no human being is all-powerful. No human being is all-knowing. No human being is capable of solving every problem. For years, I had been carrying burdens as though everything depended on me. The dream exposed how unrealistic that belief had become. I was not the savior of South Africa. No politician is. No president is. No government is. No movement is. Human leaders can contribute. They can serve. They can help create positive change. But they cannot replace God. That realization brought unexpected freedom. For a long time, I had viewed leadership as carrying everything. Now I began to see leadership differently. A leader is not called to carry everything. A leader is called to serve faithfully. A leader is called to act with integrity. A leader is called to care for people. A leader is called to pursue justice. A leader is called to remain humble. The outcome ultimately belongs to God. That truth lifted a weight from my shoulders. I no longer felt responsible for controlling every result. I no longer felt obligated to solve every problem alone. I no longer felt trapped by impossible expectations. Instead, I began learning how to trust that God was working even when I could not see it. Trust that He cared about people more than I ever could. Trust that His plans extended far beyond my understanding. As these 4 lessons settled into my heart, I realized something else. Understanding them intellectually was not enough. Knowledge alone would not change my life. The lesson required action. The dream had not ended with information. It had ended with an invitation. An invitation to observe the Sabbath. An invitation to stop striving for a moment an invitation to surrender burdens I was never meant to carry alone. That invitation still made me uncomfortable. Everything inside me wanted to stay busy. Everything inside me wanted to keep working. Everything inside me wanted to maintain control. Yet I could not ignore what I had learned. The question was no longer whether the message had meaning. The question was whether I would obey it. And so, after years of constant activity, I made a decision that felt surprisingly difficult. I decided to keep the Sabbath, not as a ritual, not as a public statement, not to impress anyone, but because I needed to discover whether trust was truly stronger than endless striving. I had learned the lessons. Now it was time to live them. And that decision would lead to one of the most important days of my life. Making the decision was easier than carrying it out. For years, my life had been built around movement. There was always another meeting to attend, another problem to discuss, another report to review, another strategy to develop. The idea of stepping away from all of it, even for a single day, felt unnatural. Part of me worried that important opportunities would be missed. Part of me worried that problems would grow worse. Part of me worried that resting would somehow make me less effective. Yet the memory of the dream remained strong. The words of Jesus continued returning to me. Rest. Give these burdens to me. So I made a decision. For one day, I would stop. Not because every challenge had disappeared. Not because the nation no longer faced difficulties. But because I wanted to discover whether faith could become something more than words. I wanted to learn what it meant to trust. When the Sabbath arrived, I deliberately chose not to follow my usual routine. I did not schedule meetings. I did not spend the day discussing political strategy. I did not immerse myself in reports and briefings. I did not chase the endless stream of urgent matters that normally demanded my attention. Instead, I created space. At first, that space felt uncomfortable. Silence as a way of revealing things we normally keep hidden beneath activity. When we stay busy, we can avoid difficult questions. We can avoid confronting our fears. We can avoid acknowledging our limitations. But when everything becomes quiet, those things often rise to the surface. That is exactly what happened to me. During those first hours, my mind kept returning to unfinished work. I thought about problems that still needed solutions. I thought about people who were suffering. I thought about responsibilities waiting for me. More than once, I felt tempted to abandon the entire experiment and return to business as usual. After all, that was familiar. That was comfortable. That was the life I knew. But I resisted the urge. Instead, I spent time in prayer. Not rushed prayers spoken between appointments. Not prayers squeezed into an already crowded schedule. Real prayer. The kind that requires patience. The kind that requires listening. The kind that requires honesty. For perhaps the first time in a long while, I stopped presenting God with plans and began presenting Him with questions. I spoke openly about my fears. I spoke openly about my frustrations. I spoke openly about the burdens I had been carrying. And then I did something that was surprisingly difficult. I stopped talking. I listened. Many people think prayer is only about speaking. What I discovered that day was that listening can be just as important. When we are constantly talking, planning, and striving, we leave little room for God to speak to our hearts. The Sabbath created that room. As the day continued, I began reflecting on my life. I thought about my journey. I thought about my successes and failures. I thought about decisions I was proud of and decisions I wished I had handled differently. I thought about the people who had influenced me. I thought about the responsibilities that had shaped me. Most importantly, I thought about the difference between serving people and trying to control outcomes. That distinction had never seemed clearer. For years, I had confused responsibility with ownership. I believed that because I cared deeply about the problems around me, I was somehow responsible for fixing all of them. But the Sabbath challenged that mindset. It reminded me that caring does not mean caring everything. Serving does not mean controlling everything. Leadership does not mean possessing unlimited strength. The more I reflected, the more I realized how much energy I had spent fighting battles that belong to God. I had been trying to manage outcomes beyond my reach. I had been worrying about circumstances I could not change. I had been carrying burdens that no human being was meant to carry alone. That realization did not make me careless. It actually helped me care more effectively. When fear no longer controls you, your judgment becomes clearer. When anxiety no longer dominates your thinking, your perspective becomes wider. When you stop trying to be the savior, you become more capable of serving. As the hours passed, I noticed something unexpected. The world continued moving without my involvement. The nation had not collapsed. The economy had not stopped. The sun still rose. People continued living their lives. The responsibilities waiting for me would still be there tomorrow. At first, that realization was humbling. Then it became freeing. I began to understand a truth that should have been obvious all along. God had never asked me to hold the world together. He had only asked me to be faithful. That truth brought a sense of relief I had not experienced in years. For so long, I had measured my value by productivity, by activity, by visible results. The Sabbath introduced a different perspective. My value did not come from how much I could accomplish in a day. My value did not come from political influence. My value did not come from public recognition. My value came from being a child of God. Everything else was secondary. That realization changed the way I viewed both success and failure. Success was no longer about controlling outcome. Failure was no longer about carrying impossible expectations. Instead, the focus shifted toward faithfulness. Was I acting with integrity? Was I serving people sincerely? Was I remaining humble? Was I trusting God with what I could not control? Those questions suddenly seemed far more important than many of the questions that normally consumed my attention. As evening approached, I felt something I had not felt for a very long time. Peace. Not the peace that comes from solving every problem. Not the peace that comes from favorable circumstances. The problems facing South Africa still existed. The challenges waiting for me had not disappeared. The work I had remained significant. Yet there was a calmness within me that had not been there before. The burden felt lighter, not because it had vanished, but because I was no longer carrying it alone. I understood that the Sabbath was not about escaping responsibility. It was about placing responsibility in its proper place. It was about remembering who God is and who I am. It was about acknowledging that human beings have limits. It was about trusting the one who does not. When that first Sabbath ended, I knew something important had happened. Nothing around me appeared dramatically different. The political landscape had not changed overnight. The nation still faced serious challenges. Yet something inside me had shifted. A foundation had begun to move. A new perspective was emerging. And although I could not fully explain it at the time, I sensed that this internal change would eventually affect every area of my life. What surprised me most was that the real transformation did not happen during the dream. The real transformation began after I chose to obey. And in the days that followed, the effects of that decision became impossible to ignore. When that first Sabbath ended, I did not wake up the next morning to a completely different world. There was no dramatic miracle, no sudden solution to every national problem, no extraordinary event that changed South Africa overnight. The unemployment figures did not suddenly disappear. Poverty did not vanish. Crime did not stop. The challenges facing ordinary families remained real. If someone had looked at the nation From the outside, they might have concluded that nothing had changed at all. But they would have been wrong, because something had changed. The change had happened inside me, and looking back now, I believe that was exactly where God intended the transformation to begin. For years, I had approached leadership from a position of pressure. Every challenge felt urgent. Every problem felt personal. Every setback felt like a burden I had to carry alone. The result was constant tension. Even when progress was being made, I rarely experienced peace. Even when victories occurred, my mind immediately moved to the next crisis. I lived in a cycle of responsibility and anxiety. Many leaders understand this feeling. You become so focused on what remains unfinished that you lose the ability to appreciate what has already been accomplished. You become so focused on problems that you stop noticing hope. You become so focused on pressure that you forget how to trust. That was happening to me. The Sabbath interrupted that cycle. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, my thinking began to change. I started noticing that I was reacting differently to situations that previously would have overwhelmed me. When difficult news arrived, I remained calmer. When criticism came, I felt less defensive. When unexpected challenges appeared, I was less likely to panic. The problems themselves had not changed. My perspective had. That difference was significant. One of the first things I noticed was greater clarity. Before, my mind often felt crowded. Too many concerns competed for attention at the same time. Every issue seemed equally urgent. Every problem demanded immediate action. As a result, it became difficult to distinguish what truly mattered from what merely felt important in the moment. After beginning to observe the Sabbath, that mental fog gradually lifted. I found myself thinking more clearly. I was better able to separate urgent matters from important matters. I was better able to focus on long-term solutions rather than constantly reacting to short-term pressures. I became more patient, and patience, I discovered, is one of the most valuable qualities a leader can possess. The second change involved fear. For a long time, fear had been operating beneath the surface of many decisions. Not fear in the obvious sense, not fear that left me unable to act, but the quieter fear that whispers constantly in a leader's mind. The fear of failure, the fear of disappointing people, the fear of making mistakes, the fear of losing influence, the fear of not doing enough. Those fears can quietly shape decisions without a person even realizing it. They create pressure, they create anxiety, they create a sense that everything depends on your performance. As I continued practicing Sabbath rest, I became increasingly aware of how much of that fear I had been carrying. And little by little, it began losing its power over me. I started understanding that my worth was not determined by perfect outcomes. I started understanding that leadership does not require perfection. It requires faithfulness. That realization brought tremendous freedom. I no longer felt trapped by impossible expectations. I no longer believed every challenge represented a personal test of my value. Instead, I began approaching difficulties with greater confidence and greater humility. The third change surprised me even more. My compassion deepened. That may seem strange. After all, I already cared deeply about people. That concern was one of the reasons I entered public life in the first place. But there is a difference between caring about people as a responsibility and seeing them as human beings. Pressure can sometimes reduce people to problems. Leaders begin seeing statistics instead of stories, policies instead of people, numbers instead of names. The Sabbath helped reverse that tendency. By slowing down, I became more attentive. By listening more carefully, I became more aware of individual struggles. By spending time with God, I found myself becoming more sensitive to the pain of others. I began noticing things I previously might have overlooked. A conversation became more meaningful. A concern became more personal. A struggle became more visible. The people of South Africa were no longer simply challenges to be solved. They were human beings deserving dignity, compassion, and respect. That shift changed the way I approach leadership. Perhaps the most surprising change involved control. For much of my life, I had believed that effective leadership required controlling as many variables as possible. Control creates a sense of security. Control creates predictability. Control creates confidence. Or at least that is what many of us believe. But the truth is that life remains unpredictable no matter how much control we seek. Nations are complex. Communities are complex. People are complex. There will always be factors beyond our influence. There will always be circumstances we cannot manage. There will always be outcomes we cannot guarantee. The Sabbath taught me to accept that reality, not with resignation, not with defeat, but with trust. Trust that God remains present even when circumstances are uncertain. Trust that His purposes continue even when my plans encounter obstacles. Trust that His wisdom extends beyond my understanding. That trust changed how I carried responsibility. I still worked hard. I still cared deeply. I still pursued solutions. But I no longer carried every burden as though the future depended entirely on my efforts. That difference made all the difference. As weeks passed, I noticed something else. My relationships improved. When a person is constantly overwhelmed, it affects how they interact with others. Stress narrows perspective. Pressure shortens patience. Anxiety reduces attentiveness. The more peace I experience internally, the more present I became with people around me. I listened better. I reacted more thoughtfully. I became less driven by urgency and more guided by purpose. These were not dramatic changes that happened overnight. They developed gradually, day by day, week by week, one lesson at a time. Yet the impact became undeniable. The dream had started the process. The Sabbath had deepened it. And now I was beginning to see the results. What amazed me most was that none of this came from working harder. It came from surrendering more. It came from acknowledging limitations. It came from trusting God with what I could not control. The very thing I had resisted for so many years had become one of the greatest sources of strength in my life. And as these changes continued unfolding within me, something else began happening. I started looking at South Africa differently. The nation I had spent years trying to help was still the same nation. The challenges remained. The struggles remained. The hopes and frustrations of the people remained. Yet my eyes had changed. And when your perspective changes, everything around you begins to look different as well. That new way of seeing would become one of the most important lessons of all. One of the most unexpected results of keeping the Sabbath was not what happened within me. It was what happened to the way I viewed the people around me. South Africa had not changed overnight. The same community still faced hardship. The same economic challenges still existed. The same concerns continued appearing in conversations across the country. Yet I found myself looking at those realities through different eyes. Before this experience, I often approached problems primarily as a leader. My mind naturally searched for solutions. When I heard about unemployment, I thought about policy. When I heard about poverty, I thought about economic strategies. When I heard about crime, I thought about systems and institutions. Those considerations remain important. Good leadership requires practical solutions. Nations cannot be governed by good intentions alone. But the Sabbath helped me realize that many problems cannot be fully understood through policy alone. Behind every statistic is a human being. Behind every report is a family. Behind every challenge is a story. And stories matter. I began spending more time listening. Not listening in order to respond. Not listening in order to debate. Simply listening. The more I listened, the more I understood that many people were carrying burdens just as heavy as the ones I had been carrying. A father worried about providing for his children. A young graduate wondering whether opportunity would ever arrive. A mother struggling to stretch limited resources far enough to care for her family. An elderly person concerned about the future of younger generations. These were not abstract issues. These were daily realities. The dream had shown me Jesus walking among ordinary people. Now I began understanding why. He saw individuals before. He saw categories. He saw human beings before. He saw social groups. He saw people before. He saw problems. That perspective challenged me. Sometimes leaders become so focused on fixing society that they forget to see the individuals who make up that society. We talk about populations. We talk about demographics. We talk about economic indicators. Yet the people living behind those numbers often remain unseen. The Sabbath helped me slow down enough to see them again. And once you truly see people, it becomes difficult to treat them as statistics. I also began recognizing something else. Many of the deepest wounds within society cannot be healed through policy alone. Policies can create opportunities. Policies can improve conditions. Policies can address structural problems. But policies alone cannot create compassion. They cannot create trust. They cannot create unity. Those things must be built person by person, relationship by relationship, community by community. For a long time, I had focused heavily on changing systems. Now I began appreciating the importance of serving people within those systems. Both matter, but one should never replace the other. As I reflected on this, I thought about trust. Trust is one of the most valuable resources any society possesses. Yet it is also one of the easiest things to lose. Many people no longer trust institutions. Many people no longer trust leaders. Many people no longer trust promises. And honestly, some of that skepticism is understandable. Trust cannot be demanded. Trust cannot be forced. Trust must be earned. It must be built slowly through consistent actions. The Sabbath taught me that lesson in a powerful way. Just as I had to learn to trust God with burdens beyond my control, leaders must earn the trust of the people they serve, not through speeches alone, not through slogans, not through public appearances, but through genuine service, through integrity, through humility, through actions that demonstrate concern for others. The more I thought about this, the more I realized that leadership is not primarily about authority. It is about stewardship. Authority asks, how much power do I possess? Stewardship asks, how well am I serving those entrusted to my care? That distinction changed the way I viewed responsibility. Instead of focusing on control, I began focusing more on service. Instead of asking how influence could be expanded, I asked how lives could be improved. Instead of viewing leadership as a position, I began viewing it as a responsibility. The difference may sound small, but it changes everything. When leadership becomes centered on service, people become the priority. When leadership becomes centered on power, power eventually becomes the priority. History offers countless examples of both approaches, and history consistently reveals which one leaves a lasting legacy. The Sabbath also deepened my understanding of compassion. Compassion is not weakness. Some people confuse the two. They believe strength requires emotional distance. They believe leadership requires detachment. They believe caring too deeply somehow reduces effectiveness. I no longer believe that. True compassion strengthens leadership. It reminds us why our work matters. It keeps us connected to the people we serve. It prevents ambition from replacing purpose. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that every person possesses dignity, regardless of their circumstances. That truth became increasingly important to me. Whether someone was wealthy or poor, whether someone agreed with me or disagreed with me, whether someone supported my ideas or criticized them, their dignity remained unchanged. That understanding transformed many of my interactions. I became less interested in winning arguments, more interested in understanding people, less interested in proving myself right, more interested in learning, less interested in defending my position, more interested in serving others. None of this happened perfectly. I am still learning. I am still growing. I still make mistakes. But the direction of my thinking changed. And that change began with a simple act of obedience, a decision to stop, a decision to rest. As these lessons continued shaping my life, I found myself thinking more and more about leadership across Africa. Not because Africa lacks talented leaders. Our continent has produced remarkable men and women throughout history, people of courage, people of vision, people who sacrificed greatly for the generations that followed. Yet Africa, like every part of the world, continues to face difficult challenges. Many communities still struggle with poverty. Many young people continue searching for opportunity. Many families continue hoping for a better future. And whenever a nation faces hardship, leadership becomes even more important. That is why I want to share something from my own experience. The greatest danger facing leaders is not always opposition. It is not always criticism. It is not always external pressure. Sometimes the greatest danger is pride. Pride is subtle. It rarely announces itself openly. Instead, it grows quietly. A leader begins receiving influence. People begin offering praise. Success begins to accumulate. Before long, the leader starts believing that he alone possesses the answers. He begins believing that his position makes him indispensable. He begins believing that power belongs to him rather than being entrusted to him. That mindset has damaged countless leaders throughout history. It has damaged governments, it has damaged institutions, it has damaged nations. The dream I experienced reminded me of a truth every leader must remember. No leader is bigger than the people he serves. No leader is greater than the mission he has been entrusted with. And no leader should ever confuse authority with superiority. Leadership is a responsibility. It is not a privilege to be exploited. It is not a throne from which to dominate others. It is a calling to serve. When leaders forget that truth, corruption becomes easier. Self-interest becomes easier. Abuse of power becomes easier. The needs of ordinary people gradually become secondary. History repeatedly warns us about this danger. And yet every generation must learn the lesson again. I believe Africa's future depends greatly on leaders who embrace humility rather than arrogance. Leaders who listen before speaking. Leaders who serve before demanding to be served. Leaders who understand that their influence exists for the benefit of others, not for themselves. The Sabbath helped teach me that lesson. When I stepped away from constant activity, I was reminded that the world continues without me. God remains in control. People continue living their lives. History continues moving forward. That realization humbles a person, and humility is healthy. It protects leaders from believing their own importance has become greater than reality. Another lesson I want to share concerns moral responsibility. Leadership is never morally neutral. Every decision affects human lives. Every policy affects families. Every action affects communities. That reality should make leaders thoughtful. It should make leaders careful. It should make leaders aware of the consequences their choices create. Too often, leadership is discussed primarily in terms of power. Who has power? Who wants power? Who loses power? But power alone is not the most important question. The more important question is how that power is used. Power can build, power can destroy, power can protect, power can exploit, power can uplift people, power can oppress people. Everything depends on the character of those who possess it. That is why integrity matters so much. Without integrity, power becomes dangerous. Without integrity, leadership becomes self-serving. Without integrity, even good intentions can eventually produce harmful outcomes. I also believe Africa needs leaders who are willing to confront injustice wherever it appears, not selectively, not only when it is politically convenient, but consistently. Justice cannot belong only to certain groups. Human dignity cannot belong only to certain people. The value of a person should never depend on wealth, status, ethnicity, political affiliation, or social position. Every human being deserves respect. Every human being deserves fairness. Every human being deserves the opportunity to live with dignity. Those principles are not merely political ideas. They are moral responsibilities. And moral responsibilities apply to everyone who exercises authority. The Sabbath deepened my understanding of another important truth. Faith must be visible through action. Many people speak about faith. Many people claim religious beliefs. Many people use spiritual language. But genuine faith eventually reveals itself through behavior. How we treat people, how we use influence, how we respond to suffering, how we handle power. These things often reveal more about our faith than our words ever could. Jesus did not simply speak about compassion. He demonstrated it. He did not simply speak about justice. He lived it. He did not simply speak about serving others. He modeled it. That example continues challenging me, and I believe it should challenge every leader, because people are not looking only for promises. They are looking for examples. They are looking for integrity. They are looking for leaders whose actions align with their words. The more I reflected on these lessons, the more convinced I became that Africa does not primarily need stronger rulers. Africa needs stronger servants. Leaders who understand that service is not weakness, it is strength. Leaders who understand that compassion is not softness, it is wisdom. Leaders who understand that humility is not surrender, it is maturity. The future of our continent will not be determined solely by economic policies, natural resources, or political systems. Those things matter, but the character of leadership matters as well, perhaps even more than we sometimes realize. As I continued reflecting on everything I had learned, one final lesson rose above all the others. It was the lesson that tied everything together, the lesson that transformed my understanding of faith, responsibility, leadership, and trust. It was the lesson the Sabbath had been teaching me from the very beginning, and it remains the most important lesson of all. As I look back on everything that began with that dream, one lesson stands above all the others. It is a lesson so simple that many people overlook it. Yet it has changed the way I live, the way I lead, and the way I understand faith. For years, I believed strength meant carrying more responsibility, more pressure, more expectations, more burdens. I believed that the strongest leaders were the ones who never stopped, the ones who never rested, the ones who pushed forward no matter how exhausted they became. But the Sabbath taught me something completely different. The greatest strength is not found in carrying everything. The greatest strength is found in knowing what to carry and what to surrender. That truth did not come easily. Like many people, I wanted control. I wanted certainty. I wanted solutions. I wanted answers. And when answers did not come quickly, I worked harder. When solutions remained distant, I pushed harder. When uncertainty increased, I tried even more aggressively to manage circumstances around me. The result was not greater peace. The result was greater exhaustion. The dream revealed something I had been unwilling to admit. There were burdens in my life that I was never meant to carry. There were responsibilities that belonged to God. There were outcomes beyond my control. There were questions I could not answer. There were problems I could not solve. No amount of effort could change those realities. The more I resisted them, the heavier life became. The more I accepted them, the lighter the burden grew. That is what the Sabbath ultimately taught me. Faith is not pretending that problems do not exist. Faith is not ignoring reality. Faith is not abandoning responsibility. Faith is trusting God with the things we cannot control while remaining faithful with the things we can. That distinction changed everything. I still care deeply about the future of South Africa. I still care about unemployment. I still care about poverty. I still care about justice. I still care about the struggles facing ordinary people. Those concerns have not disappeared. What has changed is the way I carry them. I no longer carry them alone. I no longer believe every outcome depends entirely on me. I no longer measure my worth by my ability to solve every problem. Instead, I focus on faithfulness, doing what is right, serving people sincerely, leading with integrity, acting with humility, speaking against injustice, and trusting God with the results. That trust has brought a freedom I never expected. It has not removed responsibility. It has transformed responsibility. Responsibility no longer feels like a crushing weight. It feels like a calling to serve rather than control, a calling to contribute rather than dominate, a calling to remain faithful rather than trying to become indispensable. The Sabbath also taught me something about human limitations. For much of my life, I viewed limitations as weaknesses. Now I see them differently. Limitations remind us that we are human. They remind us that we need one another. They remind us that we need God. They remind us that no individual, regardless of intelligence, influence, or determination, was designed to carry the entire world. That realization is not discouraging. It is liberating, because once we accept our limitations, we stop fighting battles we were never meant to fight. We stop trying to control what cannot be controlled. We stop exhausting ourselves chasing impossible expectations, and we begin living with greater wisdom. The older I become, the more valuable this lesson appears. Many people today are overwhelmed. They are carrying financial burdens, family burdens, health burdens, emotional burdens, spiritual burdens. Some are carrying fears about the future. Others are carrying regrets from the past. Many feel trapped between responsibilities they cannot escape and problems they cannot solve. I understand that feeling. I have lived it. That is one reason I wanted to share this story. Not because my experience is unique, but because the lesson is universal. Every human being eventually reaches a point where personal strength is no longer enough. Every human being eventually encounters circumstances beyond their control. Every human being eventually faces the choice between endless striving and genuine trust. For me, that choice began with a dream. It continued through the Sabbath, and it ultimately led me to a deeper understanding of God's faithfulness. Today, when I think about leadership, I think differently than I once did. Leadership is not proving how much you can carry. Leadership is knowing how to serve while trusting God with the weight you cannot bear alone. Leadership is not becoming the hero of every story. Leadership is helping others flourish. Leadership is not about being remembered as powerful. It is about being remembered as faithful. That may not be the lesson many people expect, but it is the lesson that changed my life. And it began the moment I stopped trying to hold everything together by myself. The day I finally kept the Sabbath was not the day all my problems disappeared. It was the day I discovered that God had never asked me to carry them alone. And perhaps that is the lesson someone listening to this story needs to hear today. You do not have to carry everything alone. You do not have to control every outcome. You do not have to solve every problem before you allow yourself to rest. There is wisdom in responsibility, but there is also wisdom in surrender. There is strength in hard work, but there is also strength in trust. And after everything I have experienced, I can honestly say this. The day I stopped trying to carry everything by myself was the day I realized that God had been carrying me all along. After everything I have experienced, I have come to understand that no power can endure if it does not serve the people. Money, status, and influence may attract attention, but they cannot restore dignity to a nation if its people continue living with injustice, poverty, and division. The world today faces enormous challenges. We see conflict in many places. We see inequality growing. We see communities struggling with fear, uncertainty, and hardship. My prayer is for a better future for South Africa, for the people of the United States, and for everyone around the world who longs for peace, justice, and human dignity. We must reject selfishness. We must reject greed. We must stand against injustice, oppression, and every form of division that separates people from one another. Instead, we must build societies founded on respect, unity, compassion, responsibility, and a commitment to future generations. No matter how difficult the road ahead may seem, do not lose faith in the future. Every nation possesses the ability to change its destiny when its people unite around what is right, what is just, and what is good. Africa will rise, justice will prevail, and hope will always belong to those who refuse to surrender their belief in a better tomorrow. If this story has spoken to your heart in any way, I invite you to share your thoughts and encouragement. Your voice may inspire someone who is carrying burdens they were never meant to carry alone. And if you believe in a future built on faith, justice, compassion, and service, continue walking with us as we spread hope to more people across Africa, the United States, and beyond. May God bless you, strengthen you, and remind you that even when the burden feels heavy, you never walk alone.